Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. I am Tanya Osensky. I'm a business attorney with my practice in Decatur, Georgia. And Cherish Dela Cruz, she is an estate planning attorney. We will be your hosts for the next hour, and we will share some more information about our background at the end. But welcome once again, and thank you. So to get us off started, we all know by now that there are many risks tied to COVID-19 pandemic. These risks include, among many things, health and safety concerns, which are obviously most important, but also there are serious employment concerns, insurance, and contract issues. Some of these risks will continue to impact business for years to come, long after the epidemic is over. But this is a great time to evaluate not just the risks, but also the opportunities that are presented by the situation. So can you go back to the topics? Oh, here we are. Here are the topics that we plan to cover today. I will briefly talk about the impact of the pandemic on contracts, but I will be focusing more on practical steps to renegotiate contracts, as well as what to do to minimize the impact of future disasters like a pandemic. Both Cherish and I will talk about preparing the business for an exit, and Cherish will also explain more about estate planning for the business owners. We'll be doing a lot of talking, but as we go along, if you have questions, please reserve them or post them on the chat, and we will get to them before the end. And we do also want to make an effort to make this as interactive as we can. So we've prepared a few poll questions for the audience just to make sure that you stay awake. So let's see who we have here, and we'd like to put up our first poll. If you would please respond just to see if your business has been affected by the pandemic and whether your business clients are primarily individuals or other businesses, or maybe some of both. Okay, so as everyone knows, over the past few months, there's been more talk and attention on force majeure clauses than most lawyers have seen since law school. You can see on this chart here how the search for the term on Google spiked in March at the start of the pandemic. What lawyers don't like to talk about is the fact that most force majeure clauses are just thrown into the contract. It's usually buried in the boilerplate, and most of the time, nobody really thinks about it. Last time it got a lot of attention was right after 9/11, and soon after that, it went back to obscurity. I'm not saying that the current attention is not warranted, but there are many other contract risks that deserve consideration too, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first, just very briefly, for those who might not know, a force majeure clause in a contract allows a party to be excused from performing its obligations during an event, which could be an act of nature, like a hurricane, for example, or another kind of unforeseeable event beyond their control, like terrorism or war. Whether it will work to get out of a contract depends on the language of the contract and also on the governing law where the clause will be interpreted, because interpretation varies very widely from state to state and country to country. If the contract doesn't have a force majeure provision, not to worry. There are legal doctrines called impossibility or frustration of purpose that are very similar. But the benefit of having the provision in the contract rather than relying on doctrine is that you can specify more particularly when and how the clause will be invoked, and you can be more intentional with what happens if there is an event like that. Usually, both the force majeure clause and the legal doctrines are construed very narrowly. And I would say it's debatable whether this pandemic would even qualify, because it can be argued very easily that it was not unforeseeable, given that we've had a lot of scientific warnings over the past few years, and even been movies and TV shows about pandemic. And we've also had many other pandemics recently, like SARS and MERS and the bird flu. So also it's very important to understand that economic hardship alone does not qualify. And you have to exhaust all other alternatives before you can get any relief. So it's far from being a magic bullet. Next slide, please. So it may be that your clients or suppliers have told you that they can't meet their obligations because of the pandemic, or it may be that your business can't meet its obligations. If you've not already done so, it's time to collect and review your existing contracts. Be sure to also include your amendments or other exhibits or other documents that might be associated with those contracts. And you should prioritize them by their importance to the business. What's the potential risk? Which contracts are more likely to fail? What's the impact to the business if they do fail? Then you make a decision on what to do for each contract. Some contracts will permit either one or both parties to unilaterally terminate the contract. In that case, it should be done in writing. And before terminating, though, take a look at the force majeure provision as well as other clauses in the agreement to better understand the risks and what the costs would be if the contract is terminated, and to better understand the potential litigation risk if it's terminated. What are the limits on liability? Is there an indemnity? Most contracts will include language around how disputes can be resolved as well as the governing law. So all of these will need to be weighed to understand the potential risk when terminating. And it's really a good idea to have an actual conversation with the other party before sending a termination notice. Now, other contracts which cannot be unilaterally terminated may need to be renegotiated. So for those, you would start that dialogue with the other party, and after you reach an agreement with them, the changes will need to be documented with an amendment. Be sure to document your position also as you go along in case there's a dispute that escalates and litigation can't be avoided. So even if your negotiations are not successful, courts will often look favorably on the efforts you've made, and it's good to have documentation. Next slide, please. So as you review each contract, take some time and also understand how much room or flexibility that the other party may have. Generally, I would say institutional and large companies have more flexibility to accommodate or to adjust to disruptions. If the other party doesn't have much flexibility, it may still be worth a conversation, but you need to understand how much room they have, and that would be helpful to you. And I suggest always that a collaborative approach is best. Compromise is better than legal action. No surprise there, especially if there's a plan to do business together again in the future. Keep in mind too that this pandemic has been a terrible impact on everyone, and be patient, be mindful that they're probably stressed out and anxious like everyone else, and they may be going through a difficult time financially right now. Also, they might be short-staffed, so responses may take longer, so bring your patience with you. When kicking off the discussions, it's smart to come to the party with alternatives. Think about it as being really about relationship management. So while asking for a contract change, think about how you might reduce the impact for them as well as for yourself, which will preserve the business relationship. Let me give you a few examples here. If you're the customer, consider asking for a payment extension or reduced fees, or 0 interest rate on late payments. You might offer a term extension of the contract in exchange. Be flexible, think about creative solutions that benefit both sides. If they reject your requests, you can ask them, hey, what accommodation are you willing to make to me? And I would definitely prepare in advance for this conversation. Think about your goals and your leverage. Negotiating leverage may now exist where it didn't exist before. Perhaps you were an insignificant customer for them before, but now since the pandemic, you're more of a key customer for them. Or perhaps their competitors are being more flexible right now. So knowing your alternatives and knowing their competitive landscape right now gives you more leverage, and they may be more willing to offer incentives to retain your business. Now there's also be a need to be more flexible right now, even if the contract is favorable to you. A good example of that is commercial leases, which are typically favorable to the landlord, and they don't usually protect the tenant foreclosures as a result of the pandemic. And landlords lately, of course, have been receiving requests from tenants for rent relief, and they can't expect these requests to continue until at least the end of the year. So far, I've seen most landlords are just waiting it out. They've been delaying pursuing remedies, but I don't think that will last forever. And in fact, there's actually nothing right now in Georgia preventing them from filing dispossessory action. However, even though the lease is very favorable to the landlord, it's likely that most of them will be willing to renegotiate rather than lose a tenant during an economic downturn. So if you're the landlord, you would do this case by case. You would offer relief depending on each tenant's business and the extent their business was damaged by the shutdown. If you're the tenant, you might ask for deferment or even abatement of rent for some time, and maybe also a waiver of certain fees like parking fees or common area maintenance charges that you're no longer using, such as janitorial services. In exchange, you should be prepared for an extension of the lease. Another option might be to negotiate an early termination of the lease with a buyout in return for a release from the contract. So I'm going to change gears now and talk about being proactive and forward-looking. So that's always a better and more fun thing to talk about. So let's do another poll at this point. There's just a couple of questions to see if you've been planning to make any changes to your business because of COVID, and if so, what kind of changes? So let's take a look. Okay, see what kind of responses we've gotten, see if people are awake. Interesting. Marketing changes are much bigger of a priority, so that's good to know. So next slide, please, we'll go on. So with all the negatives that we've been experiencing, we need to think about the positives too. So I think that now is a great opportunity to take measures to minimize the impact of a future event, whether it's a pandemic or something else. And it's a great time to really sit down and think through different kinds of events that might be possible and how your business can overcome the event or you just minimize the risk of disruption from the event. Obviously, pandemics should be on the list, but also you should think about war, terrorism, civil unrest, like we've had a lot lately, effects of climate change, and on and on. You should create and implement a business continuity plan that addresses how you would deal with a reduction in personnel and resources if such an event should happen. And then plan on periodically reviewing this plan, maybe once a year, and updated it if necessary. So with these kinds of events in mind, take a close look at your supply chain. Good supply chain practice says that you should have several suppliers in different countries and geographies. You need to spread it out. Contracts with key suppliers should require them to also implement a business continuity plan. And if it's a long-term contract, I would also require a review of their plan as well every year or so. So also, this is a great time to review your business insurance policies. And I'm talking here not just about commercial general liability, but also property insurance, which covers business interruption, cyber insurance, workers' comp, and other kinds of insurance. Not all policies are written the same. Some are written in a way that would exclude coverage for a pandemic, and some are not. And it's all in the specific language, and it's often hidden in the exclusions and riders, so you've got to read the whole thing. So as these policies come up for renewal, you should pay close attention to what's covered and what's not, and give yourself plenty of time to shop it with your insurance broker. And also watch out for those notices where they're trying to change the policy terms. Another proactive step to take right now is to update your contract forms. And this is the best time to do it. Of course, the force majeure clause should be updated to anticipate the challenges related to diseases and pandemics, but also depending on the kind of contract it is, you might want to consider a more beefed up version of the force majeure clause that includes more specific details on other things like remedies and timing. And you might either give yourself broader relief, or you might want to consider limiting the relief that the other party can get. It just depends on the transaction. This is also the time to build in more other options and flexibility in your contracts and look at other provisions. Pay particular attention to termination. Do you want the right to terminate only under specific circumstances or just for convenience? How much notice should be given? Will there be early termination fees? Will prepaid amounts be prorated? Perhaps suspension rather than termination is appropriate, like, for example, during a pandemic. Perhaps it's appropriate to include rescheduling language when a client cancels. Also, take a close look at your payment terms. If payment is contingent on achieving certain milestones, maybe build in a way to extend the milestones under some circumstances. On the other hand, the client might want to have a closely tied payment to when the buyer's performance obligations are. And if there's a long-term contract, the client really should think about asking for a renegotiation clause that they can invoke maybe once a year or once per term if there's a business downturn or a change in market conditions. Scheduling and timing are also key. As you can imagine, if you're the customer, the seller's delay can cause substantial disruption to your business. But if there's no time is of the essence clause, there may not be any relief for you. So for those contracts where it makes sense, it's a good provision to include. On the other hand, if you're the seller, being timely during a pandemic can be difficult. So you should build in more flexibility, have more delivery ranges, or even just non-binding estimates on delivery. So of course, as a lawyer, I have to say that limitation of liability clauses are more critical now than ever. The impact from COVID has forced many businesses to incur so much damages, and insurance policies are really pretty often not covering any losses. So the damage caps and exclusions in your contracts are even more critical. And it's just a great way to know what your maximum exposure will be. Finally, I would say pay special attention to the dispute resolution clause. This clause will determine whether you can effectively enforce your rights. So for example, if you receive a force majeure declaration from a Chinese supplier, having the forum in China is not going to be very helpful. Also, I would say that there will be a huge court backlogs for many years to come. And so think about alternative dispute resolutions that will permit remote video hearings and conferences, which would be faster and more practical. Next slide, please. So switching gears once again, let's take a look at buying or selling a business now post-COVID. Some small and mid-sized businesses that have been hit hard by the pandemic may be entertaining a business sale at this time, but for the most part, I would say right now, most M&A transactions have been either canceled or postponed. There's just too much uncertainty right now. And I would say that for those that are moving forward, and I would say for the foreseeable future, transactions will just take a lot longer to complete. As you can see from the slide, there's a theme here. Everything about a business sale is going to take a lot longer for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. As you might expect, there are buyers out there who are interested in taking advantage of the current conditions to make acquisitions at attractive valuations. You can expect more creative financial terms like post-closing purchase price adjustments and earnouts. And you can expect buyers to do more extensive due diligence around the impact of COVID-19 on the business, its employees, customers, and suppliers, as well as how that business responded or failed to respond to the pandemic. You can also expect them to push for lower valuations right now because of COVID-19. They will argue that the business experienced reduced working capital, disruptions from their suppliers, and lower earnings due to loss of revenue or tighter margins. For the business owner, on the other hand, if there's no urgency to sell the business right now, it's a good opportunity to plan for a good exit in the future. Generally, planning an exit should begin at least 12 months in advance. Most experts recommend beginning planning 3 to 5 years in advance. There's a lot that needs to be done to lay the groundwork to support a higher purchase price. And this is a good time to work on cleaning up the financials and your internal controls and identify all the ways that you can to boost that purchase price. Older, less productive employees should be offered attractive severance, and younger employees or employees that the new buyer will likely find essential should be offered incentives to stay. And of course, key customer and supplier relationships should be reduced to writing now. So, but of course, business owners are concerned about protecting the value that they've built, and now they may all be looking at a sudden reduction in value due to COVID. But this might actually be a great opportunity to consider transferring partial ownership of the business assets to the next generation as part of a great estate plan. And for a lot more on that subject, I'm going to hand this off to Cherish.
Thank you, Tanya. I appreciate that. In light of what Tanya was saying, I have had a lot of business clients approach me and to discuss, their own personal estate plan. A lot of business owners are so entrenched in the everyday business that the planning piece for their loved ones, which is why they started the business, might not have happened. And so what we have learned, and there were many lessons learned during the pandemic, is that we have to take a proactive approach. As business owners, you must take a proactive approach in addressing potential disability and death. And so in light of the COVID, that might mean just being sick for a couple of months if you were in the hospital as a result of the pandemic. Now, estate planning, everyone thinks that estate planning is complicated and that you have to have a lot of assets to do that. But as a business owner, you need to ensure that your business is going to survive any kind of disruption. And that disruption may be death, or it may be just a disability, you not being able to work in the business for a short period of time or a long period of time. And so really what it means is you retaining control of your property, giving what you have to the people that you love when you want to, in the way that you want to, and then also protecting all of your assets. And as a business owner, it's protecting the key assets. So for many business owners, their business and their net worth and the value and the asset that is producing the income for their loved ones is all tied up in the business, which is even more reason to take proactive steps to start the planning. So as for organizing, I know that this has been a time of reflection for a lot of business owners, and it may mean thinking about different ways of doing things. Based on the poll that we just saw, it looked like the majority of you were thinking and really reflecting on how business operations were going to change. I want you to take that same type of rationale and think about estate planning in that same way. What are the steps that you're going to do differently if you don't have a plan in place? And so as you're cleaning and organizing your own personal things, and also maybe you've had time because business is slow and you've had time to think about, reorganizing your business processes. Take that same time and that organization and start collecting things. As you organize, gather your business bank accounts, look at your life insurance, look at the deeds. Does your business own property? If it does own property, where are those deeds? Who has access to that information? Look at your old wills and trusts. Do they even address your business? And then also look at your old directives and powers of attorney. Does your power of attorney address your business and who's going to take that? I've had many situations where clients, in light of COVID and also just in general, when something happens unexpectedly, they realize that their family members or their loved ones or their business partners could not access the information at the bank because they weren't listed or they didn't have a power of attorney in place, so that they could access that information. And personally, you need to start thinking about who are the key people who will fill these critical roles. Who will act as your agent under the power of attorney? The healthcare agent who's going to take care of you. And then think, if that person who, maybe my business partner or maybe my spouse, if they couldn't do that job, who would serve next? In light of COVID and the virus spreading to multiple members of family members or impacting a certain area, we see the importance of having a succession plan in that, with respect to that. If you have children, thinking about who's going to take care of your minor children, and then who's going to take care of your affairs. As I said before, as a business owner, you should audit what you have now. What are the things that your businesses own? Do they own real estate? Have you addressed issues of intellectual property? Is there furniture, or is there equipment? What are the things that you have now? Because that will be all critical and important and a key component of your estate plan. Now, as I said before, key provisions for businesses, power of attorney and trust. And so the way that I work with my clients is we really delve into, what your business goals are, and then, thinking about what would happen during incapacity. Can your business really, these are fundamental questions that I need you to ask as a business owner. Can their business run without you? If a bus were to hit you tomorrow or today, or if you were impacted and you got the coronavirus, can the business run without you? Are you a one-person shop? And is there a contingency plan built in if you weren't able to do that? And then also fundamentally thinking, who has access to your business accounts? Does your spouse have access to your business accounts? When I'm surveying my clients, a lot of people haven't thought about this. And then will they be able to pay your bills, move around money, borrow, which is a theme that we have seen during this COVID crisis, borrowing against any lines of credit. Who has access to that? If you are in the hospital or if you are unable to, how can you ensure that your business is still moving forward if you aren't there? And then if you don't have anyone who can do these key things, who do you trust? It's somebody who needs to have, and you need to appoint that person. It can't just, and unfortunately what I have seen is, well, there are these assumptions made, but if it isn't legally formalized in a legal document which spells out who can act in your capacity when you cannot act, it doesn't matter if it is a verbal understanding between you and your partner, or a verbal understanding between you and your spouse. The institutions like the banks, broker dealers, they don't really care what you're understanding. It's what's legally written and documented. And one key component is, and what Tanya was talking about, is starting to think about your business succession plan. I know a lot of businesses in this time have had time to reflect, but thinking about the timeline of when you want to exit. Some businesses are exiting right now out of necessity. And as a business owner, you never want to exit out of necessity, because that just means it's a fire sale for your business, or you might not be, or you're exiting when you don't want to exit, which means it might not be generating the income that you need to sustain yourself. So thinking in terms, is it 1 year? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? And like Tanya had mentioned before, it's easier to plan far in advance. There's certain tax strategies that you can take advantage of if you're passing on that business and implementing that. And so I'm just going to launch a poll here about business succession planning. Okay, and just as the results have shown here, it sounds like 50% of you have planned for your business, which is fantastic. And the other 50, maybe you haven't had the time. And there's definitely no judgment. There's something that we have to learn from this crisis is that even if you haven't started the planning, taking steps now is critical. We all learn lessons. And then it looks like 100% of you aren't planning on selling the business in 5 years, which is great because then you do have the time to plan. And so, okay. And then, so if you haven't done the planning, who do you want to take over your business? Is it key employees? And if that's the case, then you need to start identifying who those key employees are, and then, like Tanya said, creating incentives for them to stay. Although it is a topsy-turvy employment market out there, the companies who do have the assets and who do have leverage because they have a lot of operating capital, they are open and willing to take, potentially your key employees. So what are the things that you are doing as a business owner to making sure that, you're retaining your key employees? Who's going to take over? Is it partners, your existing business partners, and making sure that you've evaluated that relationship? Is it spouse? Is it family that will take over? Or, are you, and if you're a closely held business, are you thinking, okay, I want to sell? Is it private equity that down the line? So just thinking and, starting these thoughts right now while you do have the time is key. And then how will the succession happen? So have you documented it? Or are these just thoughts and your ideas? Does your operating agreement address that? Because some operating agreements will address the succession, but most of the time the operating agreements that I have reviewed do not address death and disability adequately. And so it's important to have a separate buy-sell agreement, especially if you have multiple partners or owners in the business, and to formalize that. What I have seen is that there are several partnerships and businesses and joint ventures that have been under a lot of stress during this time, both financially. COVID has impacted most businesses, but even in obtaining credit lines, and so. And the incomes and the documents that have to be produced. And so this has caused, some tension between business owners. So really formalizing that agreement and making sure that you understand that with your business partners. And so right now we're going to open it up. And if you have any questions, I'm going to unmute everybody. And I think we have a question here. So Mike Skernecki, thank you for joining us, Mike, suggests that people start storing important documents in virtual vaults. Places like Everplans are good virtual storage. Can you suggest others? Tanya, do you have any comments?
No, I don't know any other vaults, but I'm sure there are plenty of things out there like that.
And let me just unmute. And I think when you're working with a financial advisor, I know that there are some, each broker dealer will have, or investment advisory company will have their own version of that. So, but having that, I mean, with my clients, when I have the business, their estate plans, they're all kept online through my client portal. And so they have, accessibility with that to access it. And then if they want me to, I'll share that information, the certain relevant documents with their successor trustees or their powers of attorney. But I can't name anything offhand. But if I think I do have some, Mike, and I'll send that over to you.
But I think it's also a good idea if you as a business owner will establish your own virtual vault for those documents, that you should have built-in access to your key folks that you want to have access to those, and make sure that you're not the only person that has access.
Tanya, and the one area that I definitely, and yes, we do have those available, those vaults through, this is Mike Skrinecki, through our, as you mentioned, but one thing in particular that I would recommend, particularly, are the healthcare directives, particularly for folks who have children over the age of 21. So what would you care to elaborate on that further?
Sure. So yes, I've had clients who weren't able to access, or their kids have gone off to college, and it's important to have a health directive. I mean, this is for anybody, especially in light of everything that has happened, and then just having a copy of it available to them. My clients have, generally they'll have their...
Yeah.
Hey, yes, we are on for 12:30, but I've also got Scott Fox on the line. I wanted to merge him in just so we can finally put this 401k question to bed.
Unmute.
Okay?
Sure.
Okay.
And then, so, yeah, but it is important to
have Stan here.
Okay. Sorry about that. But it is important to have a health directive in place for your children, because children are, I mean, a lot of parents are under the mistaken assumption that they can get their medical records and obtain information for their college children, and that is not the case. So, I've had clients whose children have gone to UGA, and unfortunately, they weren't able to access their clients, their children's records, and and they weren't even able to act as their healthcare proxy, and so a formal guardianship had to be put in place. Any other questions? I think everyone's unmuted at this point.
I think everybody's muted.
Or not muted? Okay. If anyone wants to, you can post it in the chat, and then we can ask. Do you have any other questions? Don't think we have any other questions at this time. Tanya, do you want to conclude? And then we will be sending a follow-up survey. And then if you have any additional questions or just want to reach out to Tanya and I, we are happy to connect with you. And we just want to thank you for attending this webinar.
Yeah, thank you all. Oh, go ahead.
Let me see. Hold on. I think there was a question, Q&A. Nope, go on, Tanya, while I try to.
Okay. Well, just second, Cherish, thank you to all of you for attending and helping us spread this information. If you're not a business owner yourself and you are doing this for your clients, this could be important information for your clients as well. So feel free to forward them some of the information we've shared today, or introduce them to us if they have questions that we can help with. And I appreciate all of your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. There was one other question. How do you recommend structuring an arrangement when you want key employees to become your successor? Tanya, did you see that? Sorry.
Yes, so that can be done by either putting them or making them a part owner in the business, starting off with, let's say, 1% ownership interest, and setting forth in the operating agreement what would happen in the event of your exit or disability or death, and how they would take over. Or you can do it as an employment agreement where after you exit or die or become disabled, they would then trigger their ownership after the event. And I think most people tend to go with giving them 1% to start with and growing that percent over a period of years as the business owner takes back and kind of pulls back away from the business over time while they evaluate that employee's effectiveness, and then the employee slowly takes over. So that's probably the best way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely want to do it over a period of time and be thoughtful about potentially adding markers, maybe on a yearly basis or a quarterly basis, so that there is actual progression of the employee who is going to take ownership. But it has been a very good incentive. And if you cannot, and this is something to consider as a business owner, if you cannot offer key employees that you want to keep on your payroll right now, actual additional cash because you lack the capital, then that is a good way of retaining potential employees if you know you're going to be exiting out and you don't mind those key employees taking over the business. So that could be a proposed win-win situation.
Great question.
Yes. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate that you attending, and we will send you, if you want to share this with the rest of your clients or other people in your network, we can share this recording with you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.